One of the most notorious strategies in all of Commander is the hallmark of phyrexia. Brought upon by the glistening oil, it brings perfection to those who are not. Infect, a powerful poison that can bring the mightiest of enemies to their knees, has always held a reputation in Commander as being a lethal strategy. Creatures that have Infect deal combat damage differently from normal creatures. They deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and to players in the form of poison counters. And a player that has accumulated 10 or more poison counters loses the game. Considering Commander games begin with 40 life per player, bringing down the goalpost to just 10 points of Infect damage can make quick work of players. Now, until recently, however, Infect has been tricky to pilot. The moment you're found to be playing Infect, all targets will be on you. This presents a unique challenge that until Phyrexia All Be One, most Infect decks were relegated to only the most fringe of decks. But All Will Be One introduced an addendum to the Infect archetype, Toxic. Toxic functions differently from Infect, and I think it brings a substantial enough difference that it might level the playing field. Creatures with a Toxic ability will still deal combat damage, Infect creatures do not. However, the creatures will also give the opponent a number of poison counters equal to its Toxic count. For example, if Venomous Brutalizer connects with an opponent, it will also give them 3 poison counters. If you use a card's ability like Skrelv Defector Might to give Toxic 1 to a creature, that Toxic number will be added to the total Toxic quantity on that creature. If used on the aforementioned Venomous Brutalizer, that creature will now have Toxic 4 and give 4 poison counters. If a creature has both Toxic and Infect and it connects with an opponent, it will not only give them the counters off of the Toxic count, but will also give them additional poison counters equal to the amount of damage they would have been dealt. There are applications that will demand Toxic over Infect and vice versa, and as you play with these two abilities, you will learn which of the two is more appropriate for each application. Now, that being said, we do have 2 commanders from the Corrupting Influence Precon deck that have Toxic abilities. Vishgraz the Doomhive and Ixal Sign of Atraxa, who each go about dealing poison counters out differently. Vishgraz, who is formerly known as Geth, is a more aggressive strategy, wanting to go wide with an army of infectious creatures, creating 1/1 artifact might creature tokens that all have Toxic 1, and then he himself gets bigger based on how many poison counters the table has. This is in addition to his Menace ability, making him even harder to block. We also have Ixal Sign of Atraxa, who goes for a more passive and reactive strategy, letting you steal cards off of your opponent's libraries once they become corrupted with 3 or more poison counters. She also has Flying and Vigilance and Toxic 2, making her evasive, but not as aggressive. For the deck we are building today, we are actually going to be going with Vishgraz the Doomhive. However, despite what I said earlier, we will actually be going with a less aggressive approach to this deck. We're going to be aiming to win through Infect and Toxic, accumulating those 10 poison counters on an opponent, but in a more reactive and prolific manner. To that end, let's get into the deck list. Our primary goal is to get at least 1 poison counter onto each opponent. If we can snag up additional poison counters, then we're in even better shape. We're only racing to 10, and that's going to be a lot quicker than our opponents will be, dropping us from 40 down to 0. We have Skrelv Defector Might, who can poke through to an opponent to give them 1 poison counter, or we can give Toxic 1 and Hexproof to another creature if it can't sneak through well enough. We have Venerated Rot Priest, which will both deter our opponents' spot removal as well as synergize with some spells that we have that we can target our own creatures with, which we'll get into later. Plague Mirror and Mirror Convert can both give Toxic counters, and they also double as ramp cards. Icarats gives each player a poison counter just upon it entering the battlefield. We're going to get some poison counters ourselves with this deck, but it's a negligible amount. Phyrexian Crusader is perhaps our most aggressive creature in the deck, being able to swing in for 2 poison counters. Bloated Contaminator has Toxic 1 and Trample, making it easy for it to get through at 4 power, and if it deals combat damage to a player, we get a Proliferate trigger, and this is a huge part of how we're going to be getting up to those 10 poison counters. Hand of the Praetors is a neat little lord for Infect creatures, having Infect itself as well, but it lets us hand out poison counters just for casting Infect creatures. Reaper of Sheoldred is a nasty 5-drop, having a sizable booty on it that can soak up plenty of hits and then return in kind with a poison counter, and I think this is probably our best defense card. Contaminant Grafter reminds me of a larger Bloated Contaminator, having decent stats, trample, and Toxic 1. It also gives us a proliferate trigger whenever one or more of our creatures connect, and it has a powerful corrupted ability to draw us a card and ramp us, and this only requires one opponent be at 3. Skithiryx is an iconic card in the infect strategy, and given its resilience to removal, its size, and its potential to just be a hasty and evasive threat, this is a threat we need in our corner. The Phyrexian Swarmlord sits at the top of our spell curve, but it has the potential to be a terrific endgame piece. It has Infect, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you create a 1/1 Infect debug for each poison counters your opponents have. This can create a ton of creatures, and while our deck doesn't necessarily class itself as a token deck, we do have a few cards to make tokens. The reason being is we only need 10 poison counters on an opponent to finish them off. If we have more creatures coming at them that they can actually block and they all have some form of infect on them, they're going to be taking those poison counters. We also have the new card, Norn's Decree, which is a really fun Pillow Fort style card that threatens an opponent with a poison counter should they be bold enough to attack at us. It also entices opponents who are poisoned with card draw, so it can be used to keep the heat off of us. I really love this card's design, and I would love to see more of it for this deck. Noxious Assault is my preference over Triumph of the Hordes. I'm testing this out right now to see if it can act as an alternative to the famous Game Ender. Rather than giving any of our creatures the ability to give out poison counters, it makes the blocks by our opponents a bad idea. Your creatures can still be blocked, but any creatures who do block this turn will give their controller a poison counter. The problem is that infect and toxic creatures are very small. They're very low power and toughness, so they don't really have the power to make me think that Triumph of the Hordes is a tremendously effective game ender in this deck specifically, ironically. Noxious Assault will give 1 additional point of power and toughness than the Triumph. It costs 1 additional mana compared to the Triumph, but it making the blocks be where the poison counters come from, that has me testing this slot. And if you have an opinion on this one way or another, I'd love to hear in the comments below what you think. So now that we've gotten a few folks at the table poisoned, and I swear it wasn't my fault, where do we go now? Well, I'm going to take the approach of utilizing proliferate triggers to up the poison count. Because we can proliferate any number of counters to add on to, we can actually proliferate each player's poison count, meaning we're going to be putting in less effort to adding up those counters. Work smarter, not harder. Starting off, we have Cankerbloom. It doubles as proliferate triggers and removal, and I really like the modal nature of this card. If we needed to get rid of one of the enchantments or artifacts, we've got our Cankerbloom. If we want just a generic proliferate trigger, we have our Cankerbloom. It's also a sizable creature for 2 mana if we need to swing in with it. Pollenbright Druid has an enter the battlefield ability that will also proliferate. It's a basic proliferate trigger. Park Heights Maverick is interesting because while it's evasive, it will grow larger if we target the player with the greatest life total. And then we'll get a trigger if it deals combat damage to an opponent and when it dies, so we'll get plenty of mileage out of this. Evolution Sage has a nice landfall proliferate trigger, which is very simple to trigger. Venomous Brutalizer has an ETB, where you can trade 2 mana for a proliferate trigger. Planewide Celebration is a game ender in this deck. It can give us up to 4 proliferate triggers if we so choose. If each player has 6 or more poison counters, which is pretty easy to get to with this deck, we've won. Unnatural Restoration proliferates and acts as a recursion effect. It can target any permanent we need in the graveyard. Whisper of the Dross also functions as a debuff and possibly a removal spell. It's also got a proliferate trigger. While not technically a proliferate trigger, we also run Infectious Bite, Infectious Inquiry, Vraska's Fall, and Phyrexia's Outbreak, which all give each opponent a poison counter, so it's kind of the same thing. The Outbreak is also pretty powerful, as it's literally a board wipe on our opponents that plays right into the infect strategy. We also only run Contagion Clasp, as I feel the double proliferate from Contagion Engine is nice, it's powerful, it's just costly, and it's not at the aggressive mana cost I need it to be at in order to make this deck run smoothly. Glistening Sphere also has an ETB proliferate trigger, and once an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, it then functions as a Gilded Lotus rather than an Arcane Signet. You see what I did there? Throne of Geth is also here for flavor reasons. Our commander was known as Geth once upon a December. It's also a very low mana cost artifact that can turn our additional artifacts into additional proliferate triggers. The Might creature tokens created by cards such as White Sun's Twilight, Skrelv's Hive, the treasure created by Smothering Tithe are all artifacts that we can utilize for this. I did actually consider going further into the artifact sub-theme to hasten our victory, and perhaps that can be explored in a future deck using a different commander. Now, while these creatures with Enter the Battlefield proliferate abilities are pretty sweet, we do occasionally run into the need where we need more. So to that end, I added Eldrazi Displacer, Eerie Interlude, and Ephemerate, who can all blink our creatures and our commander in order to get additional triggers of the Enter the Battlefield abilities. These can be used to get additional value out of cards like Ichor Rats as well, who give out counters just upon them hitting the battlefield. I've debated utilizing Panharmonicon in these cards instead, and then just swapping out this engine with a simple 1-drop mana Dork Suite. I personally like the ability to use these cards at instant speed to threaten a win out of nowhere, but you're free to use what works best for you. The main goal of this deck isn't to enter combat to get the poison counters we need passed around, at least not once players begin to establish their board state. Our creatures are too small to really get in for that damage, but if we can get some damage pointed out early on, and maybe get a few points of poison dished out, well, we can use them to begin building up to the poison count we need them to be at. It's much more of a passive strategy, so we'll be relying on our defensive card to keep our life total safe while we focus on infecting our opponents. Let me hear your input. How did you build your infect deck? Did you choose one of the two commanders from this pre-con deck, or did you go with a different commander? I know many players for a very long time have run with Atraxa, Praetor's Voice, for their infect strategy. Prior to this release at least, we had the proliferate trigger on her. She gave you all the colors you really needed. And of course I know that there's other decks existing out there that utilize poison as a strategy. I used to use Hapatra. Anyway, I'd love to hear from you. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to see more. And as always, I'll catch you next time.